I have my own firm, and I have the honor of getting to work on projects that I think are going to be most impactful in the gaps that I see in the energy and climate market.
Amazing. Carrie Dugan.
Hey, Hunter, thanks. And hello, everybody. Carrie Dugan. I'm also a Michigander. I'm a boomerang Michigander. I was in Washington for 10 years, where I served as then Vice President Biden's climate advisor at the White House and as the deputy of President Obama's Detroit task force before, during, and after the bankruptcy, charged with deploying novel technology, clean technology in a highly distressed environment, which we did ahead of budget, ahead of schedule and under budget, which is really, really special. And then before that, I was at the U.S. Department of Energy, the Clean Energy Office, when they used to have one. And before that, I worked at the intersection of energy, environment, and politics. So in my 20s, I was interviewing members of Congress and candidates for Congress, Senate, and the presidency, and helping decide if we're going to give them PAC money. It was a really neat, eye-opening experience when I was in my 20s to see how DC really worked. But because I'm a Midwesterner, I kept my humility intact and had a great run there. Now I run Energy Security Partners. I call it ESP for short. We don't have a lot of time on the climate clock, so I talk fast and use acronyms. My company works with large institutional partners, universities, multinational corporations, and I'm doing for them what I did for the vice president, which was coach up on climate technology, policy, politics, and how to communicate about it. I also do a lot of public-facing thought leadership. Had the benefit with Brandy and Hunter to do a lot of this more closed-door sessions to really ramp up the uh, get the Midwest back to like the varsity level in terms of thought leadership, particularly on the topics we're going to discuss today. I also am on two corporate boards on the environmental side, three-time appointee of Governor Whitmer, and I'm on the inaugural Women's Commission here in Detroit. And I went to that school.
Yes. So for those of you who went to the Michigan of the East, just know that you're going to hear a lot of Michigan love. Barney Schabel.
Thanks, Hunter. I'm here to represent the state of Massachusetts and Harvard College, as you say, the Michigan of the East. So, and I live now in California, so we've got geographical diversity right here in this room. So I spent my life at the intersection really of the insurance market and capital markets. So working on catastrophe bonds, weather derivatives, quantifying natural hazard risk, rainfall, hurricane, and figuring out ways to help people transfer that risk, whether that's emerging markets or whether that's large insurance companies or states or countries. And 10 of those years as a broker, working at Marsh, working at Goldman Sachs, and then 20 of those years at an asset management firm that we owned and ran where we invested specifically in that kind of risk. If you spend a lot of time thinking about that risk, you wind up thinking a lot about how that risk is changing. I got much more deeply involved in the topic of climate change, both on the nonprofit side. I was very deeply involved with Ceres for a long time, a nonprofit that does a lot of this work that's also based in Boston. And then more recently with Probable Futures, with other entities here in the state of California who are thinking about California's insurance challenges, and that's relevant to most states in America right now.
Amazing. Well, thank you all for joining, both on the panel and in the webinar. I think that just to sort of really ground it in the table stakes, right? Like, let's think about the home, right? This is the cornerstone of the American dream, right? For many people, it's their primary source of wealth. And the reality is that, you know, you can't get a mortgage without insurance, right? And in order to own and operate a home, right, you got to pay a utility bill. So insurance and utilities are really reshaping the cornerstone of our society. And so I think often for those of us in climate, you know, we're treated like this is a peripheral concern to the American voter or the American people, right? But now climate is showing up very concretely in the thing that most Americans care about the most, right? So this is just really like central to the priorities of everyone. So let's take those two topics, right? And let's start with insurance. Barney. Insurance, historically a topic that everybody ignored and didn't pay much attention to, right? And now it is sort of front and center. It is showing up. Insurance premiums are going up across the country. Why is that happening?
The presumption that insurance, the whole basis for insurance and building codes and a lot of other things that we'll talk about today, arose out of the assumption of a fairly stable climate. You can look at the world that you live in. How much snow do you expect? How much rain do you expect? How often do you think there's going to be a hurricane or a tornado? And that there's some stability associated with that probability distribution. So insurance is becoming expensive, more expensive, really for three reasons. The first reason is those probabilities are changing. The second is everything is becoming more expensive. We've obviously living through a particularly inflationary time. So if your house value is going up, but you also are suddenly need to replace part or all of your house, buying that and building that again is more expensive than it was a few years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So those are two of the big drivers in terms of the nominal increase in the cost of insurance. But the third reason that insurance costs are going up generally everywhere is that it's not really a market in the conventional sense. Every single state has its own set of rules as to how you can charge, what you can charge. And if one state caps, for example, how much you can increase the price of insurance every year at a fixed number, which may be lower even than inflation, let alone the change in underlying risk, then perhaps the adjacent state does not. And an insurance company is looking to try to figure out a way not to lose money and is therefore going to charge in the state where they can and not charge in the state where they can't. The biggest driver of this, though, goes back to the fact that insurance markets have always assumed supply is plentiful. And so therefore each year you can go and buy a contract. And there is, in fact, no longer term marketplace for insurance or reinsurance, no pricing like you see for a mortgage or for interest rates or for any other good that you might be purchasing. And without that information, it's very difficult for people to make good decisions. You're taking out a 30-year mortgage to buy your house, you're borrowing money for 10 years to build your office building, and you're not getting information about what is the trajectory of risk or inflation where you are. You're simply buying a 1-year policy and assuming that next year you'll also be able to buy another 1-year policy. So all of those warping factors mean that the market doesn't really behave like an actual marketplace. And all of us who are making decisions at a governmental level, at an individual level, at a corporate level, lack a lot of real information to make better decisions.
And I think that's key, Barney, right? People are seeing their insurance bills go up, right? And there's this commingling of different factors, and people are saying, "Oh, it's, climate change or it's insurance fraud," and it is potentially many, many of these things, the regulatory environment, all sort of combining and intertwining, right? And we need to be able to help people make sense of like what those factors are and where the levers are, where they can like ultimately shift things so that they can reduce their insurance bill and sort of have insurability over the long term.
Right. And the expectation for a long time was whatever I paid this year, I'm going to pay basically the same, maybe a little less next year, without thinking about 3 years, 5 years, 10 years out, it's going to be more expensive. So if your expectation is it should be plentiful and basically the same cost as this year, in a world that's changing, you're going to be disappointed.
And speaking of disappointment, Carrie, talk to us about utility bills. It seems like it rhymes with what's going on in insurance.
Womp womp. Yes. This grid that we live on, it's not your grandfather's utility bill anymore, you guys. It's as Barney just said, that was all based on a stable climate and before the AI boom. That's the sad part that people are living through, on top of the people who Brandy and I know are living with energy burden before any of this is happening. So there is a real crisis in the utility bill pricing for your average Joe. But on the flip side, if we actually get serious and make these AI data centers that are coming online responsibly built, sustainably built, using batteries, using renewables, it's a really, really unique opportunity, not only for grid stabilization, but also for the community tax base. So I try to think, Hunter, as our homes, as our these AI data centers, as our cars should all be considered energy infrastructure. So, the rates are going to go up unless we do get this right. And I'll just point out, I did a webinar, I think 2 weeks ago with some key leaders, Jigar Shah, our friend, Gary Doris, and Jim Connaughton. I do encourage you guys it's on my LinkedIn if you want to take a look at it, but it really does kind of unpack how to do it right. But to answer your questions, we're still playing our grandfather's game because of the speed and appetite for the demand of AI data centers, but that's not the world we live in anymore.
Speaking of not living in that world anymore, the way that the table was set and the way that things have been done, right? Especially on the insurance and the utility costs, right? There are some people who are disproportionately bearing those costs, right, Brandy? And so if we think about sort of a business as usual, if we sort of run things in the way that they always were run, right? There are going to be folks who are left sort of like holding the bag there, right? So talk to us about the environmental justice components of this.
Sure. And to get to that environmental justice component, I'm first going to kind of reflect what Barney and Carrie just said about that operational cost stack of our homes changing over time. And climate is being fed in there. So then it's insurance plus utilities plus maintenance, which, as they said, we thought was pretty stable. But right now, your utility bill and your insurance policy are essentially becoming climate reports on your home. And the insurance market is not waiting until the next hurricane to reprice things. They're already repricing based on risk and raising premiums and pulling back. And all of that is not transparent enough for any of us, let alone those who are disproportionately impacted by previous harms of other generations or who have low income. So when we look at communities that have been situated in historically redline areas. So those were the less desirable land plots or less desirable areas where, back in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I'm from, where they deliberately redlined Negro. There was a community of Black and Indigenous people, and they redlined that area with industrial waste purposefully. And so we have now a lot of our industrial land is in those areas who have now lived with the cumulative burden of generational harm. And that's been racialized harm or political harm based on class and income. So when you start thinking about the home as the primary asset of most Americans, and that is just a double whammy on those folks not having the information, already living with what has come before, and our markets not only are moving fast, but still not accounting for what the harms that have happened in the past. So the pricing is just all out of sorts. And when we have these policy discussions, often that is not transparent in how different people are affected differently and disproportionately.
Brandy, can you just say again, right? Your insurance and utility bills are that is a nugget that I
Yeah.
think we all need to take away from this.
Yeah, your utility bills and your insurance policy have quietly become a climate report on your home.
That's amazing. And I think people need to understand that, right? Because if you're seeing movement there, right, like that movement will continue over time, right? And so you need to use that as like an early warning signal of what's coming, right? And likely changes how you think about this. I mean, I think, for a long time, we have thought about utility bills, right? In sort of the investing world, they've been treated as a pass-through cost, right? It is something that is paid by the resident. It is not paid by the investor. And so therefore, there's been an incentive to underinvest in basically like CapEx, making the home energy efficient, putting in energy infrastructure and everything else. And so essentially, you're passing the buck onto the resident. And obviously, that has particularly happened in workforce housing and affordable housing, right? But that actually provides a huge, huge opportunity. I don't know about anybody on this call, but I think there are plenty of people who thought, let's drill, baby, drill, right? And it turns out that you're exposing yourself to a lot of price volatility doing that with everything that has happened in the Strait of Hormuz. So, Carrie, talk to us about firstly, you got to brag a little bit. I know it's not the native Michigander way to do it, but talk to us about why did LED lighting come into Detroit?
You're funny. So I mentioned that I was on the Obama task force in Detroit. I started on that task force when I was still at DOE. So I had two jobs. My day job at DOE was the Legislative, Regulatory, and Urban Affairs Director. So I'm on Capitol Hill trying to educate lawmakers about advanced technologies across the suite of E area at the time, um, so that we could make the investments and drive down the cost curve. This is at a time when none of you had heard of LEDs. It was not in the public domain yet. At night, I'm flying to Detroit where the lights have been out my entire life. Large, like half of the street lights were out. It's a very unsafe situation. The mayor came into my office, practically in tears, asking, you're from there, you care, can you please do something? And, I don't walk around with a federal checkbook when I walk around with a lot of technical assistance. So I went to Detroit and I used every diplomatic tool in my toolbox, from bringing the secretary a couple of times, bringing peer-to-peer learning because there'd only been one other city that had done a large-scale conversion, that was Los Angeles. So I brought folks from Seattle and other peers to meet with the Detroit counterparts. By the way, the city was on its way into bankruptcy. There's only like 3 people at the public lighting department at the time. Anyway, I used all those tools, which were really important in terms of, community engagement and getting feedback. And ultimately, they did choose to go LED. They weren't going to do that without our intervention from the Department of Energy. And I wouldn't have been on that team, but for Barack Obama was a community organizer at the beginning of his career. That's how I think about this stuff. So we did deploy the whole system. It was a really darling story, and I get to live in the aftermath. But I actually thought about this during the last remarks, thinking about misinformation, #China. I was in the hearing when Kathleen Hogan, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and an amazing human, was asked by a particular member of Congress if she was pro-choice in a hearing about energy. And she kept a poker face. I did not. I was sitting behind her. And she said, I am when it comes to lighting. So I do think we have to make sure that as part of this overarching context is getting information out the door so that people who own homes and assets actually know what to do. So the good news, Hunter, you want to talk about a little energy efficiency? There's no politics in energy efficiency. It's not like wind and solar, okay? It's not SMRs. There are no partisan LED light bulbs. There are no partisan blue or red windows. So as folks are taking a look at hardening your own infrastructure, your home or your buildings, I've seen a lot of folks make mistakes. I'm going to give you a really good example that I learned from our colleague, Carla Walker Miller, who was having dinner with Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett knew what she did because she was part of the Goldman, the big challenge, I forgot what it's called. And he said, Carla, I'm thinking about changing the windows in my house. And she's like, you're not going to start there. He's like, I want to do solar. And she's like, nope, you don't start there. So when somebody who is as bright and successful as Warren Buffett does not know what to do in his home first, I think that is a key message to all of us. So the recipe is do all the energy efficiency that you can first. Once you get that down in the sequence, and then you can look at your HVAC, you can get heat pumps, and you will watch your bills go down over time. Solar and the like, that'll be the last thing you do. Solar battery storage is ideal, of course. And the issue really is, what are the policies where you live? To Brandy's point on policy, there may be work to do in your particular location to get the policy right that you want to be able to do the things you want to do. So this is certainly complicated and a worthwhile topic. Thanks, Hunter.
Amazing. And I think, it's worth noting, right? Like it wasn't like the city of Detroit switched to LED light bulbs because they wanted to reduce emissions, right? But if you look at what's happened with energy use and lighting, it has collapsed over the last 10 years as better technologies have come online. And it's the same thing with folks' home, right? Like the reasons why people will do this will vary. The earliest adopters of residential solar were the Tea Party. They were not motivated by GHG or, carbon equivalents. They were motivated by wanting to be independent from the grid. So whatever people's journey is to basically reduce their utility bills, we're here for it. And there's a lot you can do. And we will connect you with those resources as well. So Barney, insurance, it's a bit of a mixed bag, right? There's plenty you can do to reduce the risk on your home, but it's not necessarily clear that your insurer will reward you for that. Talk to us about like how we should think about that.
Sure. So there's a world in which if your home, anybody's home or building, was priced properly today, then you would get a discount for reducing risk. But in a world where, in many cases today, your risk is at a level which suggests your premium is far too low, it's very difficult, even if you start making changes, to get credit for that change. And Hunter and I have talked about this before, but I wrote a piece last year with Spencer Glendon looking at the insurance markets are faced with a choice. One road is there's a real price and there's real multiple year term, as we discussed earlier, and that will give you a real signal. Now, maybe you don't pay that price. Maybe the state helps you pay that price. Maybe for some communities, they can't afford that price, but at least you know what the real risk number and the real price should be and how that trajectory is going to change over time. And then you and your insurance company have real incentive to make changes to drive the risk down, and therefore the price will go down. In most communities that are in dangerous places today, the price is functionally too low at a property level, but also just at a county level or a state level. I got my non-renewal letter from my insurance company last year saying they were non-renewing our house because the risk was low in the field that they put in. So this isn't, I think, a common assumption that people make naturally is that there's a detailed underwriting happening at your own house. But really, if you are an insurance company, you're looking at all of the houses that you cover within a region. And given the fundamental changes in cost and in risk, they're trying to find any way that they can to not lose money. So, and that's true in a lot of areas of the United States for different reasons. So it's not to say that you shouldn't take measures for mitigation in the same way that you should do the same on the energy side, as Carrie described. There are lots of things that you can do to make your house safer, and they're relatively straightforward. And then in some places, like here in California, they're making you do that anyway. They're simply coming around to your house and saying, you have to remove this tree, you have to do this because we want the community to be safer, whether this results in a break in your insurance risk or not. But either we're on that path where you start to see real prices, which will reflect real risk, which will then give you a reason to make those changes, or the path that we're currently on in most states, Massachusetts, Florida, California, is the government is simply going to provide a artificially low price to keep you insured, which is backed up by wishful thinking, which is the FAIR Plan here in California, or the what they call Citizens Insurance Company in Florida, and almost all of the coastal states have some facility like this, which enables people to stay where they are, but ultimately you're simply transferring the risk to other citizens in that state. And that's not a great path to be on either, but right now that's the path that we're on, which removes, again, going back to like, what credit do I get for hardening my home in a world where you're simply buying a policy from the government at an artificially low price? You've removed all of the economics around decision making about hardening, and then you just start talking about moving.
Barney, it almost sounds like we're privatizing the gains and socializing the losses.
Yeah, not for the first and probably last time, but that's where we stand right now.
Well, and I think, Dr. Brown, I mean, you've talked about, right, you're getting a climate report on your home and you're getting that signal, right? And if that signal becomes really ambiguous, right, or if it's hard to interpret and people can't make sense of it, right? Talk to us about what that means, right? I mean, for anyone, I mean, Warren Buffett apparently can't figure this out. And if Warren can't figure it out, then what hope do the rest of us have?
Yeah, it's a difficult issue, and I know the ins and outs, and I can't figure it out for my own home right now. So when we think about all these climate risks, and think about it like a lit stick of dynamite, there are three hands, I think, of holding that. It's the family under the household roof. It's the municipality who's responsible to keep the lights and water on, and then the ratepayers who are subsidizing the whole system. And within that, the low income households are often last in line for any upgrades or buyouts. They're income constrained. So they end up shouldering the most dangerous tail of those blitz in their least support. So when you think about all those things and you think about where the market's going, like Carrie mentioned, AI, we are looking at experiencing extreme heat plus rapid load growth from AI and data centers and all the other infrastructure developments that we need to make as a society. It's a dangerous combination if we're not planning for it equitably and being real about who's shouldering those costs. So if we're thinking about it equitably, we need to be focused on the renters who are living in a home with a leaky roof, or communities who are paying for summer cooling bills, but they can't budget for them, or homeowners and communities who live in floodplains who are not able to make clear of whatever is going on. It's not transparent for Warren Buffett. It's not transparent for me. It's definitely not transparent for them. So the socialization of these harms really need to be pulled back, because it would be a catastrophic loss on our entire economy if we are just allowing communities to shoulder this on their own. We can't let this go on autopilot. We really need to step in and figure out what are the system connects and figure out how to plan and mitigate any catastrophes on the economic side.
And that's, because essentially these systems, right, are now really breaking down, that actually presents a unique opportunity for reform, right?
Mhm.
Essentially, the way that we've thought about the grid, the way that we've thought about household energy, the way that we've thought about insurance markets, right? It's all going to have to be revisited, right? And so there's actually a unique opportunity to potentially redefine the system to be more equitable, right? If we harness this moment. So that's sort of, I think, the positive opportunity here. So within that, let's talk about some reform, right? What can happen at the policy level? So Barney, you this paper that you referenced that you and Spencer Glendon had written, and by the way, if people don't know Spencer's work, he also went to the Michigan of the East, so no slouch, and he was previously in charge of risk at Wellington, so 1 trillion under management, so brilliant guy. Also from Detroit, just so that we're making sure that there's enough Michigan love. But so this paper that you wrote, you sort of articulated, right? Option A, option B, option C, right? Could you lay those out for us?
Sure. So option A being if you actually just have a real marketplace, you would say buyers and sellers can see 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year prices based on real underlying forward-looking risk. However, you choose to make that determination. And there are many, many better tools now that are today than there were 2 years or 5 or 10 years ago to look at that risk and to look at that trajectory. So that's one option. Again, who pays for that? How you subsidize people who are in places where the risk has changed? That's a policy question. But without the actual risk information, and just to pick one example, I'm sure many of you saw Zillow started to offer risk scores for properties and was ultimately asked to pull that information by realtors who said this is going to make it harder to sell homes. I mean, that's deliberate obfuscation of really important information if you are considering about moving into a floodplain or considering living in places not far from me in Northern California that are substantially riskier than they were 5 or 10 years ago. So you have a transparent market answer, and people can make better decisions based on that signal. You have a state government provides protection, which removes that market signal, but at least allows people to feel protected and continue to get a mortgage, though they may not have protection, later on because that state vehicle will inevitably run out of money because of payments that it's making to policyholders. There is a middle ground in between, and there's a lot of work that has been done, and Hunter actually helped convene some of these gatherings over the course of the past year and a half on behalf of California. All around the world, people are dealing with this problem in other states, in other countries, in the UK for flood, in New Zealand for earthquake. And there are a variety of good ideas out there as to how do you think about the role of government, the role of business and homeowners, and the role that communities can take in managing their own risk by infrastructure investment, by encouraging certain kinds of practices around their building codes. But all of that requires a real framework and answering some questions up front. Do you want this to be a centralized facility that gives people information and best practices? Do you want there to be just entirely a private marketplace and let people make their own decisions? There are many good companies, many good ideas out there around ways to harden your home, ways to get better information, ways to transfer risk. But a lot of them are not being successfully applied because the existing outdated framework for insurance pricing and for insurance regulation in the United States doesn't encourage that. And that's starting to change. You see states like Colorado, as an example, which have seen risk change dramatically over the course of the past 5 years, be very proactive about saying, we want ideas from business owners, from other regulators, from insurance companies. We want there to be a real marketplace to allow people to protect themselves against bad things happening. What do we need to do as a state from a regulatory standpoint to make sure that we continue to have a vibrant economy here? That's not the case everywhere.
And that's one thing that I'm really grateful to you for, Barney, is, I think very often we're sort of stuck looking at our home, our state, our community, and we can get so myopic and not realize that actually this is a global problem, and it's also not the first time that we've dealt with this problem. I mean, some of the folks that we'd met with on the sort of wildfire insurance problem in California, they hadn't even really thought to look at the California Earthquake Authority, right, which is in their own state, in their own backyard, right? And so talk to us about like all of the catastrophe schemes that are out there, right? And some of the dimensions that we might want to think about in reform in terms of levers that could be pulled.
Sure. So, I mean, again, as you rightly note, this is a problem that as a society we've experienced before. A lot of the building codes that exist in America come from the large scale fires that you had in London and Chicago and here in San Francisco after the initial earthquake, where people, given the new information that they had about what was important, codified and required a certain standard. And it may be time to revisit a lot of those standards in terms of what future building practices should be, future community zoning practices should be. And some of these are really community level exposures. I live not far from, where one of the more significant fires happened, 5 years ago, and it had very little to do with house by house. It had a lot to do with an entire neighborhoods disappearing, as we saw again happen sadly in Los Angeles a little over a year ago. That's not a risk you're now managing by pricing each individual house correctly or even making changes to harden an individual house. These are community level decisions and they require community level risk taking. But private insurance companies, the state government, reinsurance companies, the broader capital markets, there are people who are good at quantifying and transferring this risk. There's a deep market for protection against tail events, but it's going to be more expensive to transfer that risk now than it was historically. And that requires, revisiting the mindset that we've had, which is this capacity is plentiful and it should be cheap.
And speaking of revisiting the mindset that we've had, Dr. Brown, you've talked about sort of, the redlining of communities, right? Sort of the, ways in which policies have been set from building codes to where we build along a variety of historical mindsets and dimensions that are now showing up, right? Like, how do we need to think about like zoning, building codes? How do we need to reimagine them? How do we need to reimagine like how we think about, sort of requirements on energy efficiency around homes? Like, talk to us about what we should be doing for the future.
Yeah, so just kind of reflecting on some of Barney's thoughts of fires and how we've historically adopted codes. Reform, I'm also adding on that EJ layer. Reform is really about changing who gets to make decisions about risk and making sure that the people who are bearing the highest price now are the ones shaping how we fix it. There are a lot of catastrophic risks that are going on, but I don't think that those who are experiencing it are the ones who are in the rooms that we are to shape policy, and that's what we need to change. So treating this treating this treating energy as a pass-through cost is one of the quiet drivers of this crisis. Hunter, you mentioned that earlier. And similarly, when local governments lack resources or political backing to enforce strong building codes, then households inherit the fragile buildings and higher lifetime operating costs. And that we can't withstand that, especially in this economy. So reform means shifting from certain investments, from volatile monthly OPEX to plain CapEx on a much more macro level. Kind of as you just mentioned, this is a worldwide problem. This is not a micro problem in singular communities. So on top of that, I would say that right now, a lot of our houses are they're still built for a climate that no longer exists. And and on top of that, developers are often fighting for the lowest possible cost, which means that we now have 1990s, maybe minimum standards in our infrastructure that are going to have risks in 2050. And so we need to start rethinking not what we've been through, but adding on that lens, that policy lens, that reform lens of knowing what we're going to go through, looking at the projections and taking them seriously, and start to front end some of our policy designs with those who bear the highest price in mind.
And I'm really glad you teed up time horizon, right? Because if you're a home builder, you might hold a home for, a year, 2 years, right? But if you're a home buyer, right, you're potentially holding that for 15 to 30 years. So there's a very different set of incentives there. And the developer is going to keep on trying to make the cheapest, all due respect, piece of crap they can sell you that looks good. And they'll sell you a climate lemon. And there are a lot of climate lemons out there. And so, we need smarter customers that know how to really diligence and how to really think through this. And we're lucky to have you three out there telling this story. So, Carrie, it's not just obviously climate directly, right, that is driving up utility costs. There's been this massive AI load growth, right? And there's a question of how does that AI load growth get powered? It could be behind the meter gas turbines, which obviously contributes to the climate crisis, will drive up insurance prices, increase risk, and everything else. But Rewiring America has teed up this homegrown energy report that actually, the entire energy build out in this country could be done through homes, putting solar and battery on homes and bringing on, gigawatts, terawatts of power, right? Talk to us about the opportunity here.
Yeah, I've been kind of separating the actors in my mind. I got a policy administration degree, so that's part of what you do. The hyperscalers right now are the most capital-rich actors in American history. So Joe Public still does not understand the scale of magnitude of the opportunity in front of us, but let's separate things out. Another set of actors is a community that's going to be impacted by a data center coming in. You were asking about policies and what needs to change. Like that right there is the most powerful at this moment of craziness to ask for what they want. But the communities don't know what they want, or they might want an ambulance, as an example, and the developers need to listen. So the next set of actors are the developers. If done right, I'm gonna put this in the chat. This is what I want your data center to look like. So if any of you have a data center coming your way, this is what's considered the most green commercial building in the world. I've literally put that in front of the developers I know, and they're like, yes. There's just an awful lot you can do. You want your house to look like that, by the way. If it's done right, Hunter, the developers will bring their money and pay for their load, and the homes can benefit if they ask for it and get the policy, local policy right. But this is all contingent on us doing away with moratoriums, or only moratoriums for data centers done wrong, and instead asking for load tariffs, which I believe there are load tariffs in 34 states or something like that. If we can get the developers, the hyperscalers, to take on the paying because they are going to benefit from this enormously, then the community can ask for a program that puts the solar on the house. But I have to go back again because I don't think everybody heard me. You're not going to do that first. Another thing I put in the chat is something called BPI. Raise your hand if you know what BPI is. I know Brandy does. Okay. I bet none of you have your hands up. I can't see everybody. A BPI is when you have a blower door test at your home to see where all the leakage is going. It is effectively a colonoscopy for your home. Less cool than Brandy's ringer. I had one done at my historic home in Detroit. Carla Walker Miller, our colleague, who you can Google her, she's awesome. Carla had one done at her historic home in Detroit. Two of the more energy literate women in Detroit had no idea what was going on in our homes. I mean, so not to scare you guys, but the energy efficiency piece comes right after you get your BPI report, your energy audit of your home. And then you can do all the other cool stuff. So, there's a bit of sequencing, and there's an awful lot of work, Hunter, to do with all these different actors. But the bottom line is do away with moratoriums, stick the load tariffs on, make the developers pay for it, get the communities educated to know what they can ask for, should ask for. I'll leave you with one final thing, and I'll Google it and put in the chat. But there's a professor at a certain school that called Sarah Mills, and she has written a playbook for communities. And I just ask everybody, all the alumni, wherever you live, to take that as a resource to your local township supervisors and get people smart. Sorry, that was all over the map, but that's how my brain works.
No, 100%. And Carrie, I mean, I think to just to Gray's point in the chat, that would be a lot of rooftops, right, to be able to power a data center. And it's not necessarily that you're going to power the entire data center, right, with rooftops, right? But the transformative opportunity to reduce or eliminate utility bills on affordable housing, LMI housing, right, and drive development in the skilled trades, which are going to be the AI resistant jobs, right? That's a meaningful component of what you could put into a data center done right package, right? Amazing. Well, there's another question in the chat that tees up our next topic from Matthew. And Matt has asked the question that I know that Carrie cannot wait to answer, and I suspect that Brandy might chime in here as well. Which regions in the US do you believe will gain long-term affordability and stability, and which are the highest risk of decline? Which Michigander wants to go first?
Everybody go like this. This is Michigan. It's Mitten State. I'm in Detroit. Brandy's from over here. I'm not kidding about this. So I had the privilege of being with Hunter at a conference in Chicago a couple years ago, 2 years ago maybe. And it was the most wild thing because I was sitting there just listening, and every presentation by everyone was everyone's moving to the Midwest. So the Midwest is considered the resilience belt. And I walk the walks. I intentionally moved back here. Obviously, there was something that happened in DC that got me out of there. But the real reason I wasn't going to stick around is I was holding a mattress up to my front windows when Hurricane Sandy came through and blew the elevator shaft off my building. And I have two kids. I'm like, I'm done, going home. We are relatively safe, and to the point where I tell people, rent luxury, buy in Michigan. And you want to buy north of the Knuckles, to be specific.
Brandy, anything to add on the Michigan point? And then also, yeah, how do we think about if people are going to be moving to this region, right? How do we do that right?
Yeah, so that was one of my primary tasks when I was leading the Office of Climate and Energy for Michigan, because we knew with projections, Michigan was one of three places in North America that we were expecting huge climate migration, and that we would be resilient, not only for our infrastructure, but our water resources, what the climate would be, agriculture, everything. And it's the only one of those three locations that isn't already oversaturated with population. So we knew at that time we have to rethink not only how people live, where people live, how they work and play, and start the building blocks for the economy of our future. So we immediately began looking out 50 to 100 years and what that influx of a population would do over time. So yeah, I'll say Michigan is great, and we're already planning for everyone to come here. I don't like telling people that though, Hunter, because I love my rural part of Michigan with the least amount of people as possible. But hey,
yeah, most of
welcome.
us are in Southeast Michigan, and the other peninsula. We have two peninsulas. Is only 3% of the state's population. I want to just double click down one level, just in terms of like being a receiving city, which is I know Barney and Hunter talk about a lot. Detroit itself is 139 square miles. It's an enormous city. It was built for 2 million people. My folks grew up here, yada, yada. There's now roughly 700,000. We just had the first increase in population in Detroit in 50 years. And for the first time in 30 years, the state's population reverse migration, it finally switched. So we finally lost fewer people than we gained. And so I think that's a real opportunity for a place like Detroit to deal. We've already talked about the retrofits ad nauseum, but anything new build should be at a much higher standard. And we need community to absolutely demand it. Okay, one more thing on the energy efficiency thing. We still have other problems to address. So the utilities are mandated to pay for energy efficiency upgrades in LMI homes. Unfortunately, what we've discovered through one of our colleagues, Ben DeWicki, 75% of the time when a worker goes up to a home to do a retrofit, this is in Detroit, they get turned away because of mold, asbestos, and other issues. There's no roof on the house. What are you going to do about it? So these are things we have to do in parallel, Hunter, as we move forward.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing or two things to add to that briefly. One is just as a reminder, Michigan is fantastic, but it's not the only place in America that is going to be a haven or an attractive destination to move to. And so a lot of the focus of this kind of discussion is here are places that are struggling, that are going to see migration or what people refer to as managed retreat. But the question is an important one because for every place like that that you can point to on a map and say, seems unlikely that in 2050 there's going to be a lot of people living there, there are other places which are only becoming more attractive destinations and are now having to think about managed arrival, right? Detroit happens to have the capacity, obviously, to digest more people moving there, but there are other places, the Pacific Northwest, Upper New England, that have some similar characteristics and are less exposed to some of what we've been talking about, but don't have the capacity today, whether that's grid capacity or uh, educational capacity or trade capacity, to build some of these new buildings or to see the economy grow, and that's a problem that we have to think about. So one of the themes, obviously, of this whole discussion is not continuing to think about this quarter and this year, but thinking about over 5 years or over 10 years. What does your insurance cost? What does your utility cost? What does the context of your community look like? And there are some places that are just not going to be attractive for human beings, and there are other places that are going to become more attractive. The second thing, though, is that doesn't mean they're risk-free, right? Obviously, if you're any of the places that you can look at on a map, and there are many organizations out there, privately and publicly, that provide some sort of projection as to what's going to be less fun to live in and what's going to be more fun to live in. That doesn't mean that you don't have to plan carefully as somebody who's moving to these places about where are you getting your power, about how are you building, about what does the long-term trajectory of that community look like? Is the agriculture in that community going to be the same in 15 years? Probably not. Is the access to water in that community going to be the same? Probably not. So, there's going to be obviously a lot of movement, and there are a lot of attractive potential destinations that are going to be able to benefit from that, but it requires planning both of the destination and of the people who are going there.
And also, it requires taking care of the people who are in the most at-risk areas. I think, a
For
lot of
sure.
people, they have their primary assets, right, in markets that historically looked very attractive and where we're already seeing value being eroded from homes by insurance premiums and utility costs and everything else. And so, you know, uh, obviously the Michiganders are, have been waiting for this moment. They're being pulled off the bench and they're ready to go. But the thing is that we're going to have to figure out solutions, right? Because of the large scale populations that we're talking about that are going to be impacted on, both physical safety and wealth and everything else. And in terms of amazing public resources to start to think through this, I would suggest that everybody check out Probable Futures, which Barney and Spencer run, and you can find some great maps and some great resources there to start to think through what it looks like and start to model out some different scenarios about where you want to plan your future. And you should think about not just your primary residence, but also your investment portfolio. You will be shocked by the level of concentration in the Sun Belt that most investment managers have provided. And so many people are doubly or triply exposed because they have a primary residence in the Sun Belt, their pensions are invested in the Sun Belt. And so you've basically got this concentration risk across your entire portfolio in one area. So phenomenal. Really, really appreciate that. We're getting close to the top of the hour, and obviously want to respect people's time. So maybe just we turn over to a few questions. Could you expand more on how people could get communities and policymakers to think about updating building codes? Where do you start? Who do you start talking to if you want to take action on this? Anybody have any thoughts?
I'll
I
just
know the guy. I know the guy who works at DOE that does the building codes. I'll find the info and put in the chat. The funny thing is, so Hunter, he lives in Michigan. Sorry, but go ahead, Brandy.
Yeah, I was just going to say building codes are one of the most difficult fights in the climate and energy space. Because you can have building codes at the national level, but then you have to get each state to adopt the building codes and put them into energy efficiency and all the state-run programs. And then you're waiting for distributors and manufacturers to catch up. So it is a long game. The more people that we have talking to developers and builders and getting them on board with what the changes are coming, I find that talking to them about their pocketbooks and how this will impact their business in the future is the best course of action. But it is difficult to move that forward. But yeah, building codes.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would emphasize, so I won't name it, but a county in Florida that obviously has huge impacts. There's actually been huge collaboration between counties and between real estate developers and business owners because they realize this is going to affect their bottom line. And so you can create unexpected alliances. I think this is a moment where strange bedfellows are really coming together to create really powerful alliances. So don't necessarily be limited by who you thought your allies in this fight might have been, because you might find that you have some powerful allies that will come to the table. And obviously, when the business community is saying, no, 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 we want this, this is vital for us to do business, you can get a seat at the table in a way that you might not have historically.
I agree. There's a lot of power in community. The only things I wanted to add, so I don't forget, is the how we talk about and communicate about these opportunities is going to be the most critical piece because there are so many bots already doing the talking for us. Thanks, China. I want you all to think about a Schoolhouse Rock video when it comes to all of these topics. It has to be that simple for the public to be able to understand and consume and see the upside. On the flip side, along with Barney's work, Sarah Kapnick, who was a chief scientist at NOAA, she's now a chief climate officer at JP Morgan Bank, puts out a piece called Climate Intuition. I want to say it's either quarterly or monthly. I don't remember. It's another good read in terms of this. The justification that we're talking about is no longer just the carbon metrics. So I'd encourage you to read those.
And then Tika asks, what is the biggest barrier today to scaling community-based renewable energy solutions, and what has worked to overcome it? Well, I love this question because that's one of the things that we're working on. I think, if you, because of sort of, utilities being treated as a pass-through cost, right? It often means that there's been this huge capex up front for either the people who can least afford it, right? Or alternatively, people are being offered like, oh, we'll give you the capex for free, but there's going to be some extremely long payback period, which obviously scares people away. And so what we're working on is potentially direct energy offtake between hyperscalers and between communities. Companies like Google and Microsoft, they have catalyzed, renewable energy and other solutions with 20-year PPAs before. That's part of the reason why we have utility scale solar and wind. And we think there's no reason why you can't do a 20-year PPA between a hyperscaler and a community. And then you're offering that energy infrastructure free to affordable housing portfolios and reducing or eliminating those utility costs. So there's real opportunity for innovation there, and we're really excited for that. And we're working on that with Carrie. Would love to work on that with Dr. Brown and with Barney if I can rope them in. Amazing. And then from Eleanor, so I think this is a good question, and we just are probably going to have to think in a geographically nuanced way about it. What are the highest ROI actions a homeowner can take in the next 2 to 3 years to reduce operating costs? Will insurers reward these actions? So I think the easier low-hanging fruit here is on the energy side. So let's talk about what we can do to reduce operating costs on the energy side.
Well, it's just going back to energy efficiency at the beginning. That's the most immediate thing you can do. And probably, the more affordable immediate thing you can do. And I'll see if I can find a good resource with the sequencing because again, it really does matter. Brandy, do you have any thoughts? Maybe you might have
Yeah,
something.
just to kind of deepen the energy efficiency. So you want to go for measures. So that's the actual upgrades, measures that protect the structure of the home and cut volatility. So that's your roof, making sure you have a great roof, the envelope of the home, insulation, making sure that it's flood safe if you have to do any grading outside your home. Upgrade your electrical panel, get a heat pump, and have backup power where feasible.
Yep. And yeah, I would also just note that, even though the solar ITC credit is expiring July 4th, that the battery ITC credit will last much, much longer. So, especially with storage, that's going to help stabilize and reduce your volatility. So, really consider storage as part of your solution as well. Barney, on the insurance side, right? I mean, you get the most complicated question because wildfire versus flood versus severe convective storms, like what should people be looking to do? And then will their insurer reward them for all that good behavior?
I think the way to, well, I guess what I would suggest is in thinking about insurance, at least under today's regulatory environment in most states, you should really be thinking about how do I make sure I can keep getting access to real insurance and not buying it from my state. So not do I get a discount, but more do I get a real company to actually sell me a real policy? And so one way to do that is there are, and as you say, it depends a little bit upon the risk, flood, wildfire, hurricane, severe convective storm, making sure you have a high quality roof matters a lot, in terms of the safety. Really, the way that I would encourage people to think about it is insurers are going to continue to cover somebody, and they're going to wind up choosing people who have the best risks. Whether you like the price or not is almost a secondary consideration at this point, as more and more people migrate into, effectively government subsidized, not particularly worthwhile coverage. So the other thing I would say is there are some businesses that are emerging which are looking at a community level, or some here in California, some elsewhere, where they're saying if I can get this condo association, homeowners association, neighborhood to make certain hardening measures, then we can make sure that that neighborhood can continue to access insurance, on a collective basis or on an individual house basis. So again, I would optimize for availability over, specifically how can you drive the bill down? Because you could get a cheaper policy from, some state official, but when the time comes and the state doesn't actually have the money to pay you, I'm not sure how worthwhile that's going to be.
Amazing. Well, if out of all of this, HOAs become a force for good that we're excited about, that will be a truly changed reality in which we're living. And that is exactly it. Like there is a unique opportunity to reshape any number of things that have historically been done. And in fact, we will have to because our world, our systems, our society was built for a very different climate. And as the climate changes, every part of those systems will have to be rethought. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to our panelists, to Dr. Brown, to Carrie Dugan, to Barney Schabel. This was phenomenal, and we couldn't have done this without you. And then, of course, thank you so much to the Harvard alumni in climate and the environment team, Matt, Michelle, DT, Eleanor, and many others, for allowing the Michigan of the East to show that we have some value to contribute in this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
For having us. Take care.
Thanks, Al.
Thank you all.